Good evening, all. This is Richard Hackett with Community Planning and Permitting staff. Thanks for attending. We will now begin our program.
All right, thanks, Rick. Thanks everyone for being here this evening to talk about some updates to the land use code related to floodplain regulations. The first part of the meeting is going to be a presentation going over the proposed changes, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. Oops. When we get to that Q&A, we will have folks will have the opportunity to put questions in the Q&A box. So at the bottom of your screen, if you click the Q&A button, you'll be able to type questions in there. We can answer those questions. You can also raise your hand and we can call on you to ask your questions. If you are on the phone, you will press *9 to raise your hand, and that should let us know that you have a question on the phone. And then you'll be able to press *6 to mute and unmute yourself. All right, so today's agenda, we'll do some introductions from the staff that are here. I will talk briefly about floodplain maps, although the maps are not changing with the docket, but I just want folks to know how to access the maps so they know where the regulations that we're talking about apply on their property. Then we'll get into the proposed text amendments, talk about next steps, and answer questions. All right, so my name is Kelly Watson. I'm the principal floodplain planner. I'm sure I've spoken with some of you or many of you over the last few years since I've been with the county. We have a brand new floodplain planner on our team, Sarah Heller. If you want to unmute and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah Heller. I'm the newest floodplain program planner. It's only my third day on the job, but I'm really excited to be here and to help out in this meeting.
Thanks. Hannah?
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah Hipley. I'm the Long Range Planning Division Manager at Boulder County Community Planning and Permitting. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hello, I'm Ron Flax. I'm the Chief Building Official for Boulder County, as well as the Deputy Director for Building and Permitting for Community Planning and Permitting.
Great, thanks. And yes, we are all with the Community Planning and Permitting Department here at Boulder County. All right, so as I said, I'm going to talk very briefly about floodplain maps. Floodplain maps, I'm putting this in big letters here. Floodplain maps are not changing as a result of this docket. We're talking about regulations today. But if you want to look up the floodplain maps for your property, you'll want to go to boco.org/floodplain. That's the main landing page for the floodplain program. And there's an big orange button there that says, view the official Boulder County floodplain map. If you click that, it'll take you to a website that looks like this with a map. I'm going to blow up the legend here. The regulations we're talking about today apply in the floodplain overlay district, which is comprised of the 100-year floodplain and floodway. So you'll also see 500-year floodplain on these maps. That's an additional layer of risk that is shown on the maps for information, but it's not part of our floodplain overlay district. So these zones that are highlighted, floodway and 100-year floodplain in both the FEMA floodplain and the Boulder County floodplain, those are the areas we're talking about today. I also want to clarify that the regulations we're talking about only apply in unincorporated parts of Boulder County. So you'll see we have municipalities, cities and towns grayed out on our floodplain map. So if you see floodplain maps in those areas, that's again sort of shown for reference only. The regulations we're talking about only apply in the unincorporated areas. And again, maps are not changing as a result of this docket. If people have questions about floodplain maps, I'll have my email address up at the end. Feel free to email me if you have questions about maps. All right, what we are talking about is some proposed changes to our regulations. You can view the draft changes at boco.org/DC-22-0004. That's the docket number for this code change. And on that website, there's a link to a document with the draft changes. You'll see there are snippets of code, and just so everyone knows, the strike-through text is proposed to be removed. Underlined text is proposed to be added. And if you want to view the existing land use code as it is, Article 4-400 contains the floodplain regulations. You can view that at boco.org/land use code. All right, let's get into it. So there are two main policy changes that we're proposing with this text update. The first is a result of a FEMA policy change, and it has to do with agricultural structures. So this is a change we're making to comply with FEMA policy. The second is a change that Mile High Flood District implemented. So again, we're bringing our code into compliance with that Mile High Flood District policy. The rest of the changes, and I'll talk about a few of them, are more clarifications. The ones I'll talk about today have to do with site plan review, manufactured homes, and allowing for emergency work. However, these are really more clarifications of ways that we are already interpreting the code, and we just want the code to reflect that. So if you look at the document online, there's a whole bunch of changes, but these are the ones that are what we're going to talk about today. And I'm happy to answer questions about any other changes. All right, so starting with this agricultural structures policy change. Currently, the land use code defines flood protection measures for 4 types of structures. So residential structures have to be elevated. So the bottom floor, the first floor, has to be elevated to the flood protection elevation. Commercial structures have to be elevated or what's called dry flood proofed, and we're not really going to talk about that today. Accessory structures can be elevated or they can be built at grade and what's called wet flood proofed if they meet certain requirements on size and or minimal investment, and that's defined in the land use code. And wet flood proof basically means having flood vents that allow floodwaters to enter the structure, and it equalizes the pressure on the walls in a flooding situation to prevent the walls from collapsing. And you can see some flood vents circled on this little shed here. What we're talking about today are agricultural structures. So currently, we allow agricultural structures to be built at grade if they are wet flood proofed. So again, we have those flood vents. FEMA changed their policy or clarified their policy a couple years ago, and this is no longer allowed. So we are proposing to update our land use code to clarify that agricultural structures have to either be elevated, dry flood proofed, or if they meet certain criteria around having low damage potential, they can be built at grade and wet flood proofed via a variance process. Most variances that we allow in the land use code have to go through the Board of Adjustment. So that involves a hearing before the board, and it's quite a lengthy process. Because the commissioners have expressed a desire to facilitate easier permitting processes for agricultural users in the county, we are proposing to make this an administrative variance process. So the variance form would be submitted with your floodplain development permit when you propose a new or substantially improved agricultural structure in the floodplain. It would be reviewed and approved by a staff committee and would not go to the Board of Adjustment. And the conditions we would be looking at for approving these variances are first that the structure would have to meet all the other requirements of the land use code that any other building has to meet, including using flood resistant materials, any service equipment, plumbing, electrical, that sort of thing has to be above the flood protection elevation or flood resistant below the flood protection elevation. The building has to be adequately anchored. And again, the building has to have low damage potential. And that's in relation to the construction, so the materials that are used, the contents, and the functions. So for example, something like a manure storage building is not something we would really want in the floodplain, because if there were a flood, we'd be putting all of those hazardous materials into the floodwaters. So we'd be looking at what the building is actually going to be used for, whether it would have a large impact in a flooding situation or if the building were damaged. And yes, and it would have to be wet flood proofed with flood vents, and we have requirements in the code on the number and size of those flood vents. So the other thing with this policy is that it only applies to structures that are used exclusively for agriculture. FEMA has a very narrow definition of agricultural structure. So multi-use barns that aren't used strictly for agricultural purposes wouldn't necessarily fall under this new variance process. Sales building wouldn't necessarily fall under this process because those have a commercial purpose. And also FEMA does not, this would not apply to buildings that FEMA does not consider insurable structures, and those are structures with 2 rigid walls and a roof. So these 2 buildings that you see here don't have 2 rigid walls and a roof, or 2 full rigid walls and a roof. So those types of structures, sort of the season extending agricultural structures and those types of structures still need a floodplain development permit if they are built in the floodplain, but they would not fall under this extra variance process. All right, I'm putting up on the screen here the proposed text. I'm not going to read through it, just to say that this first section is defining that exclusive use according to FEMA's definition. And this last part, section VII, section 7, is creating that administrative variance process. And this is an additional provision for non-conversion agreements, which we also have for accessory structures, and we are now adding for agricultural structures. All right. I don't see any questions at this point, so I'm going to go ahead right on through to cover our other proposed text amendments, and we'll take some questions at the end. All right, so our next proposed change as I said, comes from a mile-high flood district policy. So the mile-high flood district, I have a map up here showing the boundaries in black of the mile-high flood district. It covers the Denver metro area, and they do a lot of great work in floodplain management, managing stormwater systems. They do annual maintenance work in urban drainage ways. They assist municipalities with conducting flood studies and much, much more. And as I said, it's a Denver regional district. And they recently adopted a regulation that prohibits camping and makeshift structures in floodplains due to the dangers of having the life safety dangers of having those sorts of structures in mapped floodplains. So currently, Boulder County already prohibits camping in the floodway. And so for those of you who are not familiar, the floodway is a zone within the floodplain that has to be reserved for the passage of the 100-year flood. So you can see in this map on the right here, in areas that are FEMA floodplain, the floodway is shown as a red and blue hatch. And so that's this red floodway here. The area that is part of the floodplain, but outside of the floodway, is called the flood fringe. And so this proposed change we're making would expand the prohibition of camping and makeshift structures to the flood fringe.
Hey, Kelly, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. So let me just finish this one part on Mile High Flood District, and then I'll go back to that question. So as you can see, our land use code breaks out allowed uses into floodway and flood fringe. And so we are essentially just adding this camping prohibition to the flood fringe. And I want to clarify that this is a very small area of the county we're talking about. 60% of the county's floodplain is on open space where camping is already prohibited. So we're only talking about flood fringe, generally fairly narrow flood fringe areas that are not already on county or municipal open space. And I also want to clarify that we are making this change, yes, to comply with Mile High Flood District regulations, but we're also looking at this as an opportunity to educate folks about the dangers of camping in floodplain areas. And this is not something we are looking at to enforce in any punitive way or anything like that. All right, I'll pause here and go back to this one question on agricultural structures. The question is, will pre-existing structures suddenly be required to meet these new requirements? No. So all of our floodplain flood protection measures apply to new construction in the floodplain or to substantially improved buildings. And our the substantial improvement definition, substantially improved or substantially damaged. So if a structure is damaged in a flood or a fire or another event, and the costs of damage, or outside of an event, the costs of improving the building, if those costs are equal to or greater than 50% of the value of the structure, that's a substantial improvement. And that's when the entire building would have to be brought up to meet these flood protection requirements. And as Rick has helpfully put in the chat, if you do have questions about any of this, you can put them in the Q&A feature If you also have specific questions about your property, you can email us at floodplainadmin@bouldercounty.org. And when these new guidelines take effect, I'll get to that at the end of this presentation when we talk about next steps. All right, so there's 3 more proposed changes I'm just going to briefly talk about here. These, again, are what we're calling more clarifications. They're not really policy changes, but we're hoping they help clarify some of what we're already doing with our interpretation of the code. So this first one has to do with the site plan review. So this is actually in section 4-802 of the land use code. All of the other provisions we're talking about are in article 4-400, which is where all the floodplain regulations are. But this is about site plan review, so it's in a different section. So currently, the code says site plan review shall be required for any development or earthwork requiring an individual floodplain development permit. Site plan review is an additional planning process that you would go through before you apply for building or floodplain development permits. So it would come through, it could potentially be called up to the Planning Commission, and it's an opportunity for adjacent property owners and different organizations within and outside the county to review the proposed development. It also says site plan review shall not be required for any development, and I'm going to paraphrase here. Basically, at the director's discretion, we can waive or exempt site plan review for projects requiring individual floodplain development permits. So this isn't super clear, and we're hoping to clarify it a little bit by adding a clause here, basically saying, providing some examples of projects that might not require site plan review. Those types of projects would be projects that don't change the building footprint or small amounts of grading that would not otherwise require site plan review. So just trying to add a bit of clarification here as to when site plan review can be waived if a floodplain development permit is the only trigger for that review. The next change has to do with manufactured homes. I know this has, there might be some folks on here who are particularly interested in this section. Essentially, we are clarifying that in a manufactured home park, if the entire park is improved, that would not trigger the elevation of individual homes. So essentially, we are dealing with the flood protection measures on a home-by-home basis, not for the whole park. Also, we are clarifying that manufactured homes can either meet anchoring requirements that are spelled out in the code, or they can be certified by a professional engineer. And this is meant to make it slightly easier for folks to get their floodplain development permits for new or substantially improved manufactured homes. All right, this last change is pretty simple. We're adding a section here that allows for emergency work to take place if there is an immediate threat to life or property, while also requiring that that work be permitted eventually. And we have some timeframes here for when folks have to notify our department, the county engineer, that the work is taking place. All right, here are some other clarifications that we're proposing to make, such as bringing some parts of our code more in line with state and federal minimum standards, clarifying when elevation certificates are required or when a elevation can be submitted not part of an elevation certificate for buildings for new or substantially improved buildings. Clarifying that roads are an allowed use in the floodway. Clarifying some language around notice and the difference between notice and notification and comment period. Clarifying that pre-application conferences for floodplain development permits are not always required. They may be required in some cases, but not always. Better matching some definitions to FEMA definitions and some other minor changes.
Hey, Kelly, there's a few questions about the flood fringe.
Okay, I'll get to that in just a second. I do want to get to this next step slide because it might answer some people's questions about the process here. So we've posted these draft changes on the website, and we are accepting comments on those changes through the end of February. You can certainly submit comments after that, but we can't guarantee that we'll be able to respond to them before we submit our staff packet to the Planning Commission. And so that would be the next step. On March 15th is a Planning Commission hearing. And so we are planning to take this docket to the Planning Commission. And that would be a hearing that's open to the public, either in person or online. And folks can speak to the Planning Commission at that hearing. And then pending a recommendation from the Planning Commission, we would take it to a Board of County Commissioners hearing at a date and time to be decided. And for updates on all of those hearings and the process going forward, you would visit the docket webpage, which again is boco.org/DC-22-0004. All right, now let's get to some questions. I see questions in the Q&A, so we will definitely answer those. We can also potentially have folks raise their hand and ask their questions in person, but we'll try and get to the ones that are in the chat first. Also on the slide is my contact information. floodplainadmin@bouldercounty.org is a good way to reach me. Or for folks on the phone who don't do email, you can call me at 720-564-2652. And again, if you're on the phone and want to ask a question, press *9 to raise or lower your hand. And that should let us know that you have a question, and then we can tell you how to unmute and hopefully you can ask your question. All right, so I am going to start with a question from Andy. Why are you making this change and adding flood fringe? A warning of heavy impending rain seems to be more practical than adding more and more regulations. Currently, Boulder County has so many rules and regulations that Boulder County planners do not even know what they are. So flood fringe, we already have the flood fringe delineated, so that part of it is not new. What is new is adding this, basically expanding the camping regulations from just the floodway, which is part of the floodplain, to the entire floodplain. And I'll perhaps bring up this graphic again. So yeah, again, camping, we have an existing regulation that applies in the floodway, and we're expanding it to the flood fringe. And this is not really a, so this is something that, again, we would be working with partners in the county. It's more an opportunity to educate folks on the dangers of camping in floodplains. So it would not apply to, for example, if you're coming in for a building permit, this is not likely a regulation that's going to be relevant to you, or coming in for a floodplain development permit for that matter. And let me know if there's anything else I can, another way to answer that question. Is a floodplain development permit required if development is proposed on land outside the 500-year floodplain area? No. So floodplain development permits are only required for development that is inside the 100-year floodplain. So actually, if you are in the 500-year floodplain, you also don't need a floodplain development permit. And sorry, while I scroll back to my map here. So if you go to our online map, and if any part of a structure is in these highlighted zones, so floodway or 100-year floodplain, that's when you're going to need a floodplain development permit. Anything outside of those zones, either in the 500-year floodplain or outside of a mapped floodplain altogether, would not need a floodplain development permit. All right, as there is a difference between floodplain and floodway, does this proposal make any changes to the ability to build structures within a floodway? No. So as you may know, the floodway is a zone where we do not allow the construction of new buildings. So as I said before, existing buildings can remain. They can be improved according to the substantial improvement rules. But currently that, the restriction on building new buildings in floodways is not changing. About manufactured homes. Do these changes apply to existing homes in all cases, or is this just for new homes or for times when a permit for major work is needed? Right, so again, this, the rules for manufactured homes apply to new homes or to substantially improved homes. So if you are putting in a new manufactured home, it would have to be elevated and meet those anchoring requirements. Or if you are proposing a substantial improvement or repair of substantial damage to an existing home in the floodplain, again, that's when the elevation and anchoring requirements kick in. Existing homes can remain as they are until they are substantially improved. All right, hopefully I answered that question. Question from Chris: has FEMA formally adopted the BOCO revised floodplain overlay yet? Excellent question. So this is going back to the maps. So again, not part of this docket, but I'm sure it's a question many folks may have, so happy to answer this. We still do not have a timeline for when FEMA is going to change their map. So as some of you may know, we had an existing FEMA floodplain map. After the 2013 flood, the state of Colorado funded a new mapping project. It was called CHAMP, the Colorado Hazard Mapping Program. And so we got new floodplain maps. The county adopted the draft versions of those maps as the Boulder County floodplain. So you can see on this slide, we have the Boulder County flood risk zones and the FEMA flood risk zones, and we are currently regulating both of those. Eventually, FEMA will be changing out their existing firm, the existing floodplain, FEMA floodplain map, with the essentially not exactly, but essentially what is the Boulder County floodplain. And then it will be very nice. We'll have one floodplain map. And that will also be used for flood insurance, because right now only the FEMA map is used for flood insurance. However, that timeline has been delayed, and I am hopeful that it will happen later in 2023. So maybe the second half of this year, but we don't know for sure. And so feel free to keep checking in with me. I know there are some of you who check in with me on a regular basis. When are the FEMA maps going to change? And I will let you know when I know. And it is in FEMA's hands at this point, unfortunately. All right, question from Tim and Carrie. Can you clarify for the audience here that there's also a general floodplain development permit that covers certain activities without needing an additional permit? Yes, what an excellent point. So we have all development in the regulatory floodplain, so that 100-year floodplain and floodway needs a permit, but the county has a general floodplain development permit that covers certain activities that we know have very minimal impact to the floodplain. So maintenance activities, and certain, certain types of landscaping that are minimal impact, certain types of fences, not all fences. So stuff like that would be covered under our general floodplain development permit. And if anyone has questions about that, feel free to email me. All right, and I'm just gonna, sorry again, to scroll very quickly. I'm just gonna scroll to the slide that has my contact information.
And Kelly, this is Rick Hackett with staff. Tamara Durstein has a question. I will click allow to talk. So you'll be able to unmute yourself, Tamara, and ask your question.
We are not hearing you yet.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, actually, I'm very embarrassed. My phone dialed you.
Oh,
Thank you for all the people who are asking questions. My question's already been answered. Thank you.
okay, great.
Sorry.
No
Thank you.
worries.
Okay.
All right, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. We will stay on here for a little bit. If people think of questions, they can raise their hand or put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, that is all we have for this evening.
I'll just remind people if you come up with questions later, please don't hesitate to send us an email or give us a call. We're happy to take any input that you might have to offer.
Yes, thanks, Ron. We are definitely accepting comments. I see a question. Any specifics about chicken coops or chicken runs? I'm assuming that's possibly in relation to the general FDP. I think we would want to have, I need a little bit more information on the exact structure that's being proposed, and whether that would be covered under the general floodplain development permit or need an individual floodplain development permit. And that's a situation where you can just email us at floodplain admin, that admin email, and give us a description of the project, and we'll let you know for that specific project. why, Andy, I'm not sure what your question is. If you want to raise your hand, perhaps you could ask it in person. In the meantime, I will go to Sterling's question. When will an elevation certificate be required versus just floor elevations? All right, so this is, I'm going to scroll through some slides here to get to that. That section of code that we've proposed. So basically, for certain accessory structures that are built at grade with the flood vents, we would not always need an elevation certificate for that. And for folks who don't know, an elevation certificate is a FEMA form that has to be completed by a licensed surveyor at the conclusion of a project. If you've built a new or substantially improved structure in the floodplain, if you have a structure like a residential structure, commercial structure, even sometimes accessory structure, agricultural structures, you would need a full elevation certificate completed by a surveyor, and that would be a condition on your permit. But for certain accessory structures that are built at grade, we might not need that full elevation certificate. And so that's a situation where FEMA requires us to still get the finished floor elevation, but it's an easier process basically, instead of having to submit a full elevation certificate. So that's what we're attempting to put into this change here.
And Kelly, we have a raised hand as well.
Okay, Rick, would you be able to unmute whoever has raised their hand?
Yes, Kenneth, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question to Kelly.
Yes, I'm part of a small group of senior citizens. Most of all of us are at least in our 70s, and upon whose homes and property, which are near but on Left Hand Creek, Boulder County has sought to impose a regulatory floodway. I'd say that my elderly neighbors live in constant agony and fear of what Boulder County is going to do to us through the use of floodplain and floodway regulation. As you know, there was a national appeal. We went through 2 appeals, and finally FEMA recommended at the highest level a national appeal. And I guess one of my questions is, I guess the purpose of the question is to address Boulder County's continuing to express desire to, at the highest level, coordinate with FEMA, and to ask how the county intends to do that without directly addressing the result of our national FEMA recommended highest appeal result, which was not favorable to Boulder County. And Boulder County's response thus far, I did have one neighbor ask, have you informed the public that at least in one area, the new flood maps are scientifically inaccurate? And how do you know that the other mapped areas are not equally flawed, placing the public at risk?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. As I said before, the mapping changes are now in FEMA's hands. So we are waiting for FEMA to tell us the exact extents and process of how they are going to resolve your appeal. And once we have that information, we will be sharing with all the affected property owners in that appeal area how that appeal is going to be resolved with a new floodplain study. I think this, the area that was part of the appeal is an area of Left Hand Creek that has complex flooding and complex flow paths and everything that we've discussed with you. All of the rest of the floodplain maps have been reviewed and approved at state and federal levels. And so we are confident that those maps reflect the flooding conditions and that FEMA will be adopting them as a reflection of the best available information, while still allowing for further study of the area along Left Hand Creek that, as you say, has been, was appealed, and the panel agreed that it needs to be restudied. So we are waiting for FEMA for further information on that, and we'll be doing a full public process related to the floodplain maps.
Well, I guess, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to start responding to Sandy's question in the chat, that if the maps are inaccurate in one area, how do we know they are not inaccurate in other areas? And it's a good question. So I think the subject of this appeal, it's an area that was mapped as best it could be at the time, but the appeal, which again was reviewed by an independent panel, they found problems with it, but that was only in this one area. And I think the issues with that floodplain mapping were specific to this area and the type of flooding that we see along Left Hand Creek as it comes out of the mountains and into the plains, and the complexities of modeling that floodplain. In other areas of the county, from the canyon areas to the plains areas, the mapping we have in terms of what's shown on the Boulder County map, which is that more recent post 2013 flood study. Those maps are representing the current conditions, the current flooding risks, and as I say, have been reviewed at produced by the state and reviewed by FEMA and their contractors, and have been determined to be the best risk information that we have.
My impression is that the Boulder County has complete control over the zoning overlay district, and that Boulder does not need FEMA's permission to correct this situation. In our case, which is tremendously unjust, has affected our health and our well-being, as you well know, particularly at this stage of life. And there can only be one reason if the county intends a lack of emergency override in this situation. And according to the words in the national decision, it clearly won't be about public health and safety.
So as I've said, sorry, I was thinking about other questions. The county has a determination over the FEMA. Let me start again. The FEMA maps are maps that we have to enforce. And so that's what's on the FEMA floodplain. Boulder County does not have authority to not regulate those floodplains. The Boulder County maps, which is what you're talking about, the county adopted as a way to incorporate the CHAMP mapping. And we did adopt preliminary versions of those maps before they were adopted by FEMA. And in most cases, in 99% of the county, those maps will be adopted by FEMA unchanged, and the county adopted them as Boulder County floodplain with the expectation that they will be the future floodplain maps and that we should be regulating to them as best available information, which we do have authority to do. In your one case where this particular area was appealed, you know, that those maps have been shown to be wrong. Unfortunately, we can't just immediately get rid of them. So we have to go through a public process, but it's we are unable to go through that public process until we have that further direction from FEMA. And so we are continuing to be at the hands of FEMA. And I know, I mean, I realize the frustration that you guys are going through, and I'm very sympathetic. And no one wants to have their house in a floodway, but unfortunately, this is a situation where we are in the hands of FEMA at this point, and will be communicating with you and, as I said, all the other affected property owners as soon as we have that further direction.
Well, I disagree. I just want you to understand that the effect that this has had on our health and our well-being, our retirements, our families. We even think it's caused the demise of one of us, the sheer stress of this. And his poor widow has been unable to sell her home and is devastated, as we all are.
Yes, I do appreciate the difficulty of it, and we will continue to work with you. So thanks for that. I do want to get to a couple other questions that I see in the Q&A. One from Leela. I am not able to see FEMA boundaries on the GIS map, only the Boulder County zones. What do I need to see both? So there may be some areas of the county where there is no FEMA floodplain, and vice versa. There may be no Boulder County floodplain. So if, yeah, it depends what part of the county you're in, and if you're concerned about it, send me an email and I can confirm whether, I'm just putting my email up on the screen again. I can confirm whether there is FEMA or Boulder County floodplain in that area. Question from Andy, please clarify what you mean when you stated that Boulder County would not be seeking punitive action against property owners that do not abide by your new rules and regulations. So this was specific to that rule on camping in floodplains, where we are using this as, we are changing the regulation, but with the intent of using it as an opportunity to educate folks about camping in floodplains, and it is not something where we are going out and punitively enforcing this on folks who are camping in floodplains. So that was sort of specific to that regulation. All of our other regulations are enforced through our typical land use code processes and the violation processes which are found in the land use code. If you have questions about that, let me know. Question from Sandy, who at FEMA makes the decision about how they will resolve the mistakes made? It would be important for people to know who to talk to. So I'm assuming this is going back to the mapping questions and the appeals that were submitted. So when FEMA releases a proposed change to the floodplain maps, they run an appeal period. And so appeals can be submitted during that defined period, and then they are reviewed by the FEMA region and approved by FEMA headquarters. And there's not really, it would all be done through the, whoever is running the appeal for that specific mapping update.
Kelly, we have a raised hand by Michael.
Okay, let's go to Michael, and then we'll get to the questions in the chat. Rick, do we still have that raised hand?
This is Rick Hackettstaff. I don't see any raised hands currently in the list.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I will get to Suzanne's question. Hi, Suzanne. What do you plan to do with the incorrect mapping in our area that puts homes on the river in the 500-year floodplain, which means that they can do anything that might create an obstruction that would send substantial floodwater in unpredictable directions and toward properties that are not incorrectly put in the floodway, not on the stream, who by this incorrect floodway widened and overreach will now be prohibited from protecting themselves. And for those who don't know, floodway has been interpreted to us as a region in which we cannot even use sandbags. So sandbags are not a permanent obstruction. The temporary sandbags would not be something you need a floodplain development permit for. So that's, I don't think I've ever said that to you about sandbags specifically. So again, as I said, and I'm sorry, I don't have better information to give you. We are, FEMA is redoing the study of your area, and in the meantime, the currently effective FEMA map will be in place for this area, and we are waiting to see when and how FEMA will proceed with this restudy. And it does take a long time. All of these mapping updates take a long time. We're now almost coming up on 10 years after the flood, and we still don't have new maps. We're still using flood maps from the 80s in some cases, in some areas. That's what the FEMA effective floodplain mapping is in some cases. So these floodplain mapping updates do take a while, and FEMA is restudying this one area while still allowing those old maps to go away in the rest of the county and use the new CHAMP maps eventually at some point when we receive that direction from FEMA, which we're hoping we will get that direction very soon. Is the FEMA appeal period still open? No, that period was run in 2020 and again in 2021, and there is not an opportunity to appeal those maps again. Question from Sandy: if you know for a fact that putting people's properties in the floodway in certain areas is absolutely wrong, why are you keeping people in the floodway currently? So it's not a question of keeping people in the floodway. So this one specific area of floodway, you know, was reviewed. It was a flood study that was reviewed, and many engineers who participated in that flood study informed the county that it was accurate. And when it went to the independent panel, they had questions, which is why FEMA is redoing that area. It is just a matter of time here while we wait for direction from FEMA for that floodway to, for this particular area of floodway to be replaced or to go away and be regulated in a different way. So how much time? I wish I knew. I ask FEMA on an almost weekly basis. All right. So as we've put in the chat, written comments on the land use code text amendments can be emailed to us and will be considered by the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners. Who do I ask at FEMA, and why is FEMA not answering you? So I'm working with the FEMA region, and they are working with FEMA headquarters, and apparently it has been put on hold by FEMA headquarters, and they are not sharing who or why. We will be unadopting the maps in a fully public process, a zoning map amendment. But as I've told you, we cannot start that process until we know the extent of the area that will be restudied. We still don't have final confirmation of that. I can share with you guys my who I'm looking at, who I'm contacting, and we can do that offline. All right, we have some more questions on the floodplain mapping. I'm happy to stay on with that group. I'm not seeing any more questions about the floodplain regulations, so I want to let people have their time back this evening. If we do see more questions on floodplain regulations, we can answer those, or you can send them to me at floodplainadmin@bouldercounty.org. And otherwise, I will be happy to answer questions on these maps as they come in. So a question from Mike: why are you using the maps? So it's not that we are using the maps, it's that these are the maps that were adopted, and to not use them requires a zoning map amendment. We are preparing for that. Again, as soon as we have the direction from FEMA that we need to proceed with that, we will be proceeding with all haste possible. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I think it would be useful for us to set up a separate meeting with Mike and Suzanne and Kenneth and you folks to go over this instead of asking questions in chat and me answering back to them. So
So it does sound like maybe an additional meeting to talk about the portions of the floodway that were in the appeal might be useful to talk through some of these questions.
yeah, and I can answer Suzanne's question about the floodway definition, because that is a part of the regulations we're changing. Essentially, we're bringing that definition into basically have it match the FEMA and state definitions. Let me see if I can find it. So this is one area. Essentially, this is the definition that FEMA gives for floodway, and we just want it to match that FEMA floodway definition. This is not a policy change. This is how floodways have always been defined in terms of when we talk about not increasing water surface elevations more than a designated height. That is something that comes from the models behind the floodplain maps, and basically encroaching on the, do I have this graphic? So basically, if you imagine filling in the sides of the floodplain, that would increase the water surface elevation, and the state and FEMA define an allowable increase that's an allowed, and that's when you define the floodway. And FEMA has gobs of guidance on how to do that in a modeling sense. So all we're doing with our proposed changes to that definition is just matching the FEMA definition, essentially. Also happy to chat about that more with you guys in a separate meeting. All right, Ron, go ahead. I saw you on mute.
I was just going to thank everybody for their time this evening.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and conclude this meeting. Feel free to, as I said, send me emails. Let me know if you have comments on the regulations, and look forward to hearing from you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
The recording of this session will be on that. We'll link to it on the docket webpage. It's also on our community, on our department YouTube page. It might take us a few days to get it up there. Thank you. And Mike, we'll figure out how we want that meeting to go offline.
Thanks, Kelly, and all for attending. This wraps up this meeting. Again, go to the docket webpage that Kelly has posted, boco.org/DC-22-0004 for more information. And we'll have a link to the recording of this video up by tomorrow. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.